Thank you, dear brother. It's a great privilege to introduce our dear friend, David Vaughn, coming to speak to us on planting truly indigenous churches in the 21st century. Brother?
My goal is to try to move fairly quickly through this material so that we can have a question and answer time. This topic is of the greatest importance. I wonder if any of our brethren in New England have ever tried to plant a palm tree where they live. So you're laughing now. All I did was ask a question. But you say, never would I do that. It wouldn't grow. Or if you did manage to plant it for a while, you'd be fussing around it all the time to keep it barely alive, wouldn't you? And some churches that we plant in other countries are like that. We're fussing around them all the time to keep them barely alive because they're not indigenous. They're not indigenous plants to that culture. We haven't made them indigenous in the way that we've planted them. And do you see how serious this is? A church of the Lord Jesus Christ that can't thrive, that can't fulfill its purpose. It can't reproduce like it should, and all because it's not indigenous. And that has to do with the way that we plant churches. So we want to talk about this issue with the greatest of interest. And in the history of missions, we have made great errors and in this regard. Let me say just a couple of things in introduction before we really get into it. Church planting is not the only type of work that must be accomplished into missions. I don't want you to misunderstand me. We've seen enough, haven't we, in these reports to know that the work of missions is very diverse. Paul is doing this pioneer church evangelism and church planting in unreached areas, but he sends Timothy back to an established church in Corinth, and he says to Titus, stay in Crete and put everything in order. And Timothy and Titus are missionaries too, but they're not doing what Paul is doing. There's a work of the original planting, and there's a work of consolidation. There's also the work of training leaders. The great missionary Robert Jaffrey, who was superintendent of the CNMA mission in Indochina at the beginning of the century, and who was used in a very fruitful work in Laos and Vietnam. He actually took Chinese missionaries and went to Indonesia. And within 10 years, they had Chinese missionaries on virtually every major island of Indonesia. Anyway, a great man. And A.W. Tozer wrote his biography. Tozer only wrote 2 biographies, but he wrote one on Robert Jaffrey with a wonderful title, Let My People Go. And he says this, Jaffrey believed in the Bible school for training leaders as part of missionary work with a positiveness amounting to sheer dogmatism. He knew its power and promoted it with unremitting zeal. Foreign missionaries will never be the last word in the evangelization of any country. The best and swiftest work would always be done by Christian nationals operating among their own people. But these must first be taught. And then he goes on to describe why, for him, the Bible school, which was his method, was so important. So training leaders, church consolidation, church planting where there's never, all of these things and more are part of missions work. When we think of Paul's particular work as a church planter, we see that his first priority was to plant churches in places where the gospel had not yet been heard. He explains to the Romans why he had never been to the Roman Christians, why he'd never been to Rome, even though it was such an important place. He says, I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. So he felt his call and his role to be such that I must not build on someone else's foundation. I'm doing pioneer work. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him shall see, and those who have never heard will understand. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. And in our network, we also need to put a priority on planting churches among those who have never heard. We must never forget that aspect as we go about many other aspects. And this aspect is indeed a foundation-laying work. Paul puts it this way, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. If you're an American church planter in the U.S., you may lay the foundation of a church and stick around and build the different stories of the building, bring that church to total maturity, and actually just become its settled pastor. But the missionary church planter can't do that. Paul says, I laid a foundation and someone else is building on it. And that's why in the book of Acts, the key thing we see is movement. Plant, move. Plant, move. Plant, keep on going. That's Paul's particular call, and those who do this sort of work follow that pattern. And this is why in 10 to 12 years, Paul could plant churches in the 4 Roman provinces of Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, and Asia, and say, now there is no more place for me to work in these regions, I go to Spain. It's not that there were no unreached people, it's that in each region he had planted 2 or 3 churches near enough to each other to cooperate and strengthen each other, and so they would evangelize the region. And this is the Pauline method. Now, to get to our subject, we want to talk about what's called indigenous church planting, or planting indigenous churches. What was the situation before the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s? So I'm going to tell you about a great change that came about. But before that time, missionaries worked in a certain way. They tended to set up missionary compounds. They tended to control the whole work, provide all the money. They would, as soon as men showed promise, they would take them out of their vocations in violation of 1 Corinthians 7:17 and following. And they would make them paid workers to help in evangelism and missionary work. This was a disaster for numerous reasons. One reason was they took these men out of their natural place, their vocation in which they had natural ties with people of their own culture and could reach them, and put them into an artificial situation. They had no more salary by which they could support a church when it was there. They took too many men out of their real natural calling. But there are many other reasons why this was a problem, and we'll get to them. But they stayed around, the missionaries. They lived on their compounds. They provided money. And without realizing it, they were creating a situation in which they were training the Christian workers to be passive and dependent. Dependent on the missions money, because that's where their funds came from, and passive because they weren't the leaders, they were just doing what the missionaries told them to do. In the 80s, I worked with a campus Christian organization in Ivory Coast, and I had the opportunity to go around the country and work with churches of all the different denominations. In the summers, we would take the students up and do evangelistic campaigns from village to village, from town to town, in all of Ivory Coast, really. And we would do that in collaboration with local churches. We would go up, we would give them, the local church, some evangelistic training, and then together with the students, we would do evangelism in the town or the village. In traveling and setting up things like this for the next summer, I would sometimes go from town to town and meet with the pastors in each town. And I noticed something that was very depressing to me. I would arrive in a town, and there would be a church of planted by a certain mission there. And there were 4 or 5 missions that had a lot of work in Ivory Coast. Come to the missionary compound, the missionaries would still be there, even though they'd been around 50, 60 years. The Western missionaries would be there, and the national pastor would also be living somewhere on the compound. And what I noticed was, it was just a very depressing situation on these compounds. The pastors often weren't doing anything. They were sitting around, and when you talk to them about doing a campaign with them or for them, it was like pulling teeth sometime. It was just very depressing to me, except whenever I arrived at a town where the church was an Assemblies of God church. If it was an Assemblies of God church, there was no missionary compound, there was no Western missionary, and when I got there, I dealt with an African pastor who was dynamic, who was doing things, who was happy to have us come because he wanted to do more evangelism, and he was happy to have his people trained. I was really scratching my head because I knew a lot of the folks in some of these churches, and it wasn't that they were more mature or better taught. It wasn't that the churches themselves were in a better situation theologically or spiritually, but there was just much more dynamic. Well, I didn't know who Melvin Hodges was. Melvin Hodges was an Assemblies of God missionary who wrote on the 3 self principle and had a tremendous impact upon the whole work of the Assemblies of God all over the world. And they learned through Melvin Hodges and others to plant indigenous churches. And when you have indigenous churches, you have men who are not passively waiting on the missionary to tell him what to do. It's their thing. It's their work. They've got to get on with it, and they feel in direct contact with Christ about the thing. Well, how did things change? In 1796, 2 men were born. 2 babies, 2 boys, one in America and one in Great Britain, one in England. Both of them lost their mother at 7 years old. Both of them lost their father at 17 years old. Both of them graduated from college in 1818. Both of them became senior secretary of a major missions organization, and both of them became famous in that work. And both of them, without any apparent collusion, knowledge of what the other was doing, came to a groundbreaking discovery of 3 principles in order to plant indigenous churches: self-propagating, self-governing, and self-supporting. Rufus Anderson in America and Henry Venn in England. Anderson was the director of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and Henry Venn was the secretary of the Church Missionary Society of the Anglican Church. Their impact spread. There were others who caught on to this in China, in Korea. There was John Nivius, very important man, missionary in China. he took these principles to Korea, where they completely changed the way of doing missions in Korea. And if you want to explain in part why the Christian church is what it is in Korea today, John Nivius and these principles. And did you know that this past year, South Korea passed the United States of America as being the country that sends the most missionaries to the world? Roland Allen is the one who popularized the 3 self-principles. He wrote a very famous book called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours? Woo. He wrote several other books too, The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church. And then there were more modern writers like Melvin Hodges. I would really encourage the network to exhort all men and women involved in missionary work in this network to read the writings of these men. I think it's a disaster if people are working on the mission field and have not at all read these things. It's of great, great importance. So, what is the general thesis? The general thesis of these writers is that the Apostle Paul tailored his church planting methods intentionally so that upon his leaving, there would be an indigenous church that would grow in that soil, in that culture, in that place, and that would be self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating from the time he left, and even before he left. How did he do this? Well, he didn't stay too long in one place. If you notice in the book of Acts, Paul did not seek workers from Jerusalem or Antioch in order to make them elders or pastors in Philippi or in Corinth. He expected men to be raised up by the Holy Spirit and gifted in those places, and that the church could govern itself. He did not bring money to the churches he planted. In fact, exactly the opposite. We find him asking churches for money, even young churches, to help the believers in Jerusalem and Judea who were the victims of famine, and also to help him in his missionary endeavors. He obviously expected the churches to be self-propagating, because when he writes to the Thessalonians, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 1, the passage that I think Gordon referred to earlier, and he says that you've become imitators of us and of the Lord, and you have become an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia, for not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but it's gone out in every place. The word of the Lord is sounded forth from you, and he writes in the New Testament that's the example that I want for all the churches. That's what I've been trying to do everywhere. I want self-propagating churches. And he says, so that we don't need to say anything. And I might be wrong about this, but I think part of what he means is when he's in that region, he doesn't need to say, well, look, we're good guys, you can trust what we say, because in that region, people have already heard from the Thessalonians, hey, these guys, he says, they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you. No, we've already heard, you don't need to tell us. The Thessalonians said, we welcome those guys with open arms. Their message changed our life. You need to listen to it too. So the word of the Lord went out from this self-propagating church. So what we want to do now is just talk about some ideas of these 3 points. What do we do to plant self-governing, self-propagating, and self-supporting churches in other cultures? And I'm just going to go through a list of ideas. Some of these you might not agree with me about. You might throw them out. And these principles are not some sort of, we're not dealing with law, we're dealing with wisdom. Okay? So in applying these principles, we have to be careful not to make them some sort of legalistic chain that actually ends up hurting the church. We want to respect the principles for reasons that I'll mention in a moment, and we want to be faithful to the Lord in that way, but we want to be wise and prudent in the way we do it. Okay, let's talk about the first self-governing. How do we send to another culture so that the workers work in such a way that the church is self-governing? Number one, make it clear to the church from the beginning that your aim is to leave them as soon as possible and to leave them with their own leadership. The people in Grenoble thought I was a bit crazy when, from the first year, I talked about leaving. Well, you just got here. What do you say? But I wanted them to know that I'm trying to replace myself with the Frenchman as soon as possible. Number two, as soon as possible involve suitable men in leadership activities, leading services, leading prayer meetings, Bible studies, planning evangelistic outreach, and involve them in decision-making processes from the beginning. Consult with them, even if they're not elders. Consult with them. What do you think we should do about this? I remember one meeting that we had when we were stagnating a bit in the church plan in Grenoble, and I asked one of the men, Pascal, if he would lead a brainstorming meeting about how we can do evangelism. I was out of ideas, and it was amazing. He set up a board, and he had tons of sticky papers, and I didn't know this, but he did this all the time in his work. He knew techniques of brainstorming. And within about 20 minutes, we had 60 ideas from the little group. And he had his sticky papers all over the place, and then he began to move them around and categorize them because some of them were about the same. And then he began to ask, okay, which one of these groups is most feasible and most important? But it was marvelous that he's the one that did it. It was so important for the church, and I couldn't have done it nearly as well. And I wouldn't have known that I couldn't have done it nearly as well unless I had let him do it. Encourage the building of relationships apart from the missionary and his family. Don't be the center of everything, even in relationship building. Have the church officers brought in by church vote as soon as possible. Make the drawing up of your church documents a corporate venture. They should be in on it. Well, what should we say about this in our documents? As much as possible in things like constitution and such. As you exercise pastoral and preaching functions, or as your missionary does, let it be clear that this is a temporary interim provision. I'm not the settled pastor of this congregation. I'm a church planter. And when nationals lead, this is important, when nationals lead, teach, preach, conduct projects or such, don't let them look to you for all the answers as soon as there's a problem. Let them stew. Let them work it out. Tell them to ask some of the other brethren that are nationals. We'll say, well, what do you think? And when they finish something, their first preaching or their first leading an evangelistic activity, don't sit down and evaluate them in such a way as to show them everything that was wrong with it, just because you've had 30 years of experience. Because all that will do will persuade them over time, I'll never be able to do it like the missionary. Show them what they've done right. If there are a couple of key things where they can improve, show them those and leave the rest. once you're gone, don't let people treat you as if you're still there. This happened to me as soon as I left Grenoble. There's something going on. They want to do something. Call the ex-missionary church planter. What should we do, David? Or other people wanted something to do with the church, and they call me as if I'm still there. And my response was, talk to the elders. I'm not there anymore. And I think that's very important. Even simple things like when I would go back up and preach at the beginning, I was going back up every couple of months, and they would want me to be the one to take initiative to contact a family in the church in Grenoble and say, could I stay with you? And I refused to do it. I'm not taking that initiative. It's up to them. They're having me come. The elders have got to get their act together and work this out and tell me it's all set up. And I kept pushing and pushing. And sometimes they would call me and say, so you're coming next week. Who are you staying with? And I would say, I don't know. Who have you set up for me? But it's just that sort of a thing, that relationships that's got to change. So those are some of the things for developing self-governing churches and teaching the church to take on the leadership itself. Now let's talk about self-supporting. Paul's 3 principles. Paul did not seek financial help for himself from the churches he planted. He did not ask or accept support from those to whom he preached. Listen to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And, when you first hear about these 3 selves, sometimes people don't actually get it. My own home church in Fayetteville years ago sat down with me and said, we think the church in Grenoble should start taking on some of your support. And I said, never. That's not what the self-supporting principle means. In fact, you're going to do exactly the opposite. If they start spending a lot of their money supporting me, they'll never be able to save enough, buy their own building, and then have enough to pay for their own pastor. I'd seen too many churches in France who had foreign missionaries and could only have foreign missionaries because they were spending so much paying their rent every month that they could never pay a salary. So we met in a home at the beginning. We saved tons of money. We moved to a school, and all we rented it was for Sunday morning. Continued to save. And I kept talking to them, save, give. The time's coming when you're going to need a church building. And if you have a church building and you own it, your money can go to where it should, for the work or for the man. And so I told my sending church, no, they mustn't support me. I don't want them supporting me. In fact, one element that helped a lady come to the Lord in the church plant, Nadine had been coming for years to our evangelistic Bible study, had been under conviction of sin, and was worried yet that we might be a cult. And I heard later that one day she asked one of the people in the church, where does David get his money? And when the person said, well, he doesn't get any from us, this gave her tremendous confidence that this was not a money-making scheme, that I was coming giving something completely free with no strings attached. And this is what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 9, 14 and 15. He says, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. And he says further on in verse 18, what then is my reward, that in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. I will tell you that at the last 2 or 3 years, I allowed the Grenoble church, because they were really pleading with me for this opportunity, I allowed them to pay for my French Social Security costs. But they already owned their building with no debt by then, and I thought it would be a good thing for them to be able to do. But the principle was I wanted to put them in a position to become self-supporting. And that, in that situation, meant you can't become self-supporting if almost all your money for the whole church planning time comes to me. Paul didn't seek financial help for himself. He did not bring money to his converts. He expected them to be financially independent, and he obliged the churches to administer their own funds. So when you send a church planter out, his principle must be, in this church plant, I know nothing, well, not I know nothing, but I don't touch the money. The nationals are the treasurers and the accountants for the church. They're giving the money, and they're taking care of the money. And there are checks and balances that you put in place, of course, in any church. But the foreign missionary is not the one to manage funds. In fact, when Paul takes money down to Judea, he says that he wants the churches to send someone with him. Listen to this. He says in 1 Corinthians 16:3, "And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." Boy, he really puts it in their camp, doesn't he? He says, you're even the ones who are going to decide if I go with this money. But even if I go, I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to carry it. You handle your own funds. I think it's quite amazing. So, in practical terms, the writers on the three self-principles tend to say that two things must be demanded of the church from the beginning, and two things can be safely done by the mission in terms of money-related issues. The two things which the church plant must provide from their own finances is their building, their meeting place, and the salary of their pastor when they come to have one. Now, I'm going to nuance that in a minute, okay? But that's the basic principle, that those two fundamental things, they mustn't become dependent on outside money. The two things that the mission can safely provide without making them dependent on foreign money is an itinerant ministry. So the work of the missionary who can continue to go from town to town and preach in new preaching points, and leadership training, Bible school, the sort of thing we saw here with what our brother's doing in China, the training of pastors and leaders. Now, nuance time. In a church in a large city where the cost of property is so high that it would be really out of reach of a small beginning church plant, we can see the wisdom of money being given from your church to help them have a facility at the beginning. But doing it in a wise way so that the gift is digressive, so that you're giving less each year, and the church plant is taking on more each year. In Grenoble, we didn't ever have to have a dime from anyone else. In Aix, a Heritage Church is helping out. The church plant is paying for most of its rent, but we can't quite make it. And so Heritage is helping, but in a digressive way. Same thing probably with workers. I know that in ARBCA, we had a digressive way of helping out national workers or when they were first working in a brand new, very small place. But the principle is that we don't do it in such a way that it's permanent and that it causes dependence on foreign money. And if it has to be, then the church plant has to settle for what they're able to afford. And if their young pastor, first pastor, has to be a tent maker and be half-time pastor and half-time working in the secular world, then so be it, if that's the way to avoid an issue of dependence, just as Paul sometimes made tents. Let me give you a few strong motivations about this issue of money, and this issue of self-supporting is the longest one. The self-propagating is going to be more short, just because this one is so tempting to make mistakes in, and it's so devastating when we do make mistakes. Number one, if you're funneling money in such a way as you're making the church plant dependent on the foreign money, it stifles initiative and a sense of responsibility that are necessary to produce a strong Christian faith and character. You know, in some cities, there are mission churches that are just really struggling, funded by mission money, and they're barely making it. But in the same city and in the midst of the same poverty, there are indigenous churches that are thriving and have their own facilities. And it just shows you that something's going on here that's not right. And really, I meant to leave this at the end, but I'll put it here. The contribution that Roland Allen really made, in my opinion, to this whole thing that was, in addition to what others wrote, is he showed that really this whole issue is an issue of trust in the Holy Spirit. When we push men to be leaders, and they're not doing things as well as perhaps the experienced missionary, it's because we believe in the new covenant ministry of the Spirit, who gifts and who gives sufficient gifts. And those gifts aren't completely developed. But we can back off because as Spurgeon said when he came up the steps to preach, he would say to himself, I believe in the Holy Spirit, I believe it. And the missionary on the field, when he's pushing the nationals to do the work, to support themselves, to propagate, I believe in the Holy Spirit, I believe in the Holy Spirit. That's the whole key to this. We can let go. And we all have fears, don't we? And especially men who are extraordinarily gifted and perfectionistic. It's hard to say, oh, he's not going to do this right. But it's actually better for him to do it partially wrong. And for the Spirit of God to be solicited in his life by his own dependence and struggling and striving and bringing out all the gift of God that's within him. So, coming back to this money issue, it keeps national workers from learning to depend on and trust in God to do the impossible. And how many times in your ministry has money been the place where you've learned to trust God? Where you've been put in a situation that's really grave. Because if you don't have the money, you don't eat. And if we deprive the nationals of that experience, of being pushed to the wall, and pleading with God and seeing God answer, then we've deprived them of something enormous for their own development. It also stops national workers from planning and working for advance and progress in the work. Do you know why? Because the person who depends on outside money, he works on this principle. I do as much as I got coming. If the pipeline stops, I don't try to do anything else. But if I'm not dependent on that pipeline, I'm dependent on God, who knows what He'll provide. Let's try to do this and ask God. A whole different mentality is developed. It encourages men to aspire to leadership from wrong motives, financial gain and security. You've heard of rice Christians? People who became Christians because the mission was giving out rice. Well, there are rice pastors as well. There really are. I remember a couple of years ago, Jim relating being appalled in Cuba one time when at the end of a meeting, He noticed the Cuban pastors lined up, and there was a briefcase, and I guess it was the missionary was doling out the salary of for dozens of men. Here it was, it was $15 for each of them, which, seems like a great deal. You can support a missionary for a whole month for $15. But can you imagine what that does in terms of creating the rice pasture and also creating the image of a foreign entity? In communist Cuba, American money. If the authorities find out about this, what is the church? Well, it's funded by the CIA, we're sure of it. It's a briefcase just like the CIA agents have. This dependence on foreign money also tends to develop the presupposition that the national Christians are inferior. There was a seminary in Africa where the students received full scholarship from anonymous donors in North America on the condition that they write prayer letters to these donors with their request of prayer. Do you see any problem with that? Well, the only problem was the donors didn't have to write the African Christians and tell their needs and their struggles. It was a one-way thing, you see. The Africans were inferior. We need the prayer from the North Americans, but the North Americans don't need our prayer. I don't know why that is. So what do we do practically? Well, we teach on giving. We have to do it. We require the church to provide its own building and pastor salary as much as possible. We have the church manage its own budget from the beginning. As soon as possible, we have the church set up a building fund and a pastor fund if they don't have a pastor yet. We did this. We looked forward, and I said we need to think of two things for the future. Start saving money for facilities and for the setup cost of a pastor in his first months of salary. So that we're ready. We're going to do this ourselves. As soon as possible, encourage the church to give a tithe of its revenue to missions. We did this the whole life of the church in Grenoble while we were there. Even though it was a missions church, it was giving to Indonesia and Pobun Sing and other places. Wonderful for the church from the very beginning to do something like that. Okay, last point, and this will be short. We've talked about self-governing. We talked about self-supporting. And now, what do we do to develop self-propagating churches? And here's where I feel personally that I've done the poorest job in Grenoble. Though they're really evangelizing and doing evangelism, I don't think I inculcated this conviction that every local church should see itself as a planter of other churches. So I'm still close enough to work on that with them, but I think this is one thing I've really not done enough. But anyway, teach that all believers have a duty and privilege to be a witness for Christ. Do evangelism training in every church you plant. I've tried to do this. Several sessions of evangelism training, how to answer difficult questions, how to share the gospel. Take the believers with you when you witness, or invite them over when you're inviting non-Christians for dinner and you know you're going to have some conversation about the gospel. Don't just invite those non-Christians by yourself. Have some of the nationals there. Let them watch. Let them contribute to the witness. Have regular evangelistic activities that demand and involve their participation. When you have regular evangelistic services, everybody's got to do something. They've got to get out there and invite their friends and talk to them, talk to non-Christians, give out flyers, go to the market, and now they're involved in some level. But if you don't have any set evangelistic activities like that, you have nothing to draw them into, to force them or to encourage them to to be involved in active witness. Acquaint them with good evangelistic literature. I think this is really important. Have them read certain key booklets that are very good, and say, read this for such and such a friend and see what you think. And if you think it's good, give it to them. Because you don't give things out unless you're motivated by, hey, that's exactly what I wanted to say to that person. In church meetings, pray a lot for evangelistic opportunities and unsaved friends. And inculcate the conviction that all churches, as much as possible, should plant other churches. And last, pray regularly and systematically for other overseas missions, country by country, and for the sending of missionaries from this church plant that perhaps doesn't even have a pastor yet. But go ahead. In Grenoble, we had a monthly prayer meeting on Sunday afternoon that was exclusively devoted to praying for overseas missions. And we went through Operation World together. One of the men talked about it, and we prayed through the world. In Aix-en-Provence, we do it every Wednesday. We start every prayer meeting with praying for a country, and one of the men or myself talk just briefly about that country. But keeping before the people always a vision for the world, that they are part of a world-gathering church, Now, those are the three selves, but they're not enough. Because it's been found that a church can be self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating, and not be indigenous. It can have a very Western flavor, anyway, and not be able to thrive once the foreign missionaries are gone. It's like that banana plant in Canada. It just won't grow there being a banana plant. And so we have got to plant churches in such a way that the programs, the methods, the ways of life, the ways of living as a church really belong to that culture. They're really not artificial. They're not something that demands some sort of input from outside. They're what you could do just by being Colombian or Bolivian or Burmese. Okay, just a couple things on that, and I'll be very quick. Church programs, methods, and machinery should be readily available to the people in that culture and easily maintained by them. In one place in Africa, a missionary was doing lots of village-to-village evangelism and taking the nationals with him. He had I don't know what you call it in English. We call it in French a 4x4. It's one of these four-wheel drive vehicles that can go over all sorts of terrain, all-terrain sort of vehicle. And he would take the guys and show them how to do that. And he just couldn't figure out when he was elsewhere why they didn't carry on this work. And finally, one day he sat down with them and, why aren't you guys doing the village-to-village evangelism? Well, we don't have a 4x4. You know what he did? He got rid of the thing and began using a bicycle to go from village to village. And they started evangelizing from village to village themselves without him. Very interesting. We can so easily make mistakes that we don't realize we're making. We had no idea that this would be a bad thing. And this is why it takes a lot of prayer and God's grace to keep us on track in these things. Church buildings should be in native style. This should everything else. The dress and the manner and when you have a church meal, the way it's done and the things that are eaten. It's easy to say these things. I'm having a problem in our French church with our French people now, because some of them are translating Getty songs, and that's fine. That's not my problem. My problem is that French is a language where there's all the syllables are pretty much equally accented. And in English, we have heavily accented syllables. Hero. Hero. Not hero. And the music that's written for these hymns is written so that for the English language, and it forces you to accent one syllable. And when you say it in French, it's not French. You don't accent that like that. But the French guys love these hymns so much that they're making these terrible translations. And, it's not terrible. It's just that it doesn't sound French. Well, whatever. They're not obeying the three self principle. It's not my problem. But I am at least telling them, do you really think this sounds French? But anyway, a missionary should never take a position which a national could fill, and he should constantly stand in the background as much as possible so the church will have a native face. When we have an evangelistic meeting and it's me that's preaching, there must be a French person leading the meeting. I must not lead the meeting. And I must not get another non-French person to lead it if there is one, even if he's the best at leading meetings. We had an Englishman in our church in Grenoble. If I was preaching, I guarantee you he wasn't presiding over the service. And he didn't understand that, but I did. I want a French face. And last, the missionary must be very sensitive to the culture, determined to adapt his ways of living, his ways of eating, food, style of dress, ways of greeting, ways of developing and carrying on friendships, customs, and relating to authorities. In Ivory Coast, when we arrived in the village, the first thing you have to do is go straight to the hut of the village chief and greet him. You do not come into a village where there's a church, go to the Christians in the village, settle down, eat supper, and then start your meeting that night without seeing But you've got to follow the culture. Perspectives on the use of time, being on time, or not worrying about being on time, chilling. How loud you talk. I don't preach like this in France. You know how you can know that someone's American on a tramway or on a subway in France? Because he's talking like this. Did you see that? And everybody in the place knows. But if you're going to live in France, you have to begin to learn to change the volume of your voice. These things are so important to be able to have an impact and to be embraced by the people, that we must make sure that our missionaries get some sort of cross-cultural training. One of the brothers I was eating with him yesterday, and he said the young lady, teenager, is going out to a certain African country soon on a 3-week trip, and I said, does she know that she mustn't wear trousers? Because only prostitutes in Ivory Coast wear trousers. Well, if you give someone no training, how could she know that? Paul says, I make myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. These are not techniques. They're not marketing techniques. They are an expression of gospel love and servanthood. When the Campus Crusade women that I was on staff with did not wear trousers for years, as long as their feet were on the continent of Africa, that was not a technique. That was gospel love and servanthood. That was making sure I'm not putting a stumbling block in the way of the gospel. To the Jews, I become a Jew in order to win the Jews. It wins because it's a spiritual thing. To those under the law, I became as under the law that I might win those under the law. And on and on. He says that I become all things to all people that by all means I might win some. And this is the sort of thing that we must do in order to plant indigenous churches. I don't know if we have time for just a couple of questions. Okay. Jim, could you? Okay. Well, I may refer a question or two to Jim to get his thought on them, but this material might have raised some questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask. Well, what I think doesn't matter too much, but the Bible shows us that Paul had a very complex and diverse group with him. You remember at the very beginning of the message, I tried to say that. I said that missionary work is diverse, and it's not just church planting. It happens. I said that so quick that you might not have heard it, but missionary work is not just church planting. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But that being said, we need to be careful. Because missionary work is so diverse, many churches fall into the trap of doing everything but church planting. And a missionary that had been in China for his whole lifetime, he was in his 90s. I heard this from Howard Hendricks on a tape. Howard Hendricks was speaking, the professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He said he's talking to this old missionary, and the missionary told him half of the missionaries on the field all over the world could be taken off the mission field with no appreciable impact on the work of world missions. And unfortunately, that is true. And so we must be careful that we are paying attention to the fact that the primary thing that God has called us to do is to plant churches that will evangelize and make disciples of the world.
Some of these churches that you planted, the elders that are there, how do you go about encouraging them in their walks as you've already left? So you're not in the picture anymore, but they're there, maybe struggling.
Yeah.
How do you encourage them, or does somebody else come in afterwards and encourage them in their faith and stuff like that?
Well, I go back up to Grenoble regularly and preach and spend time with him. We just in the spring we had a retreat with our church plant in the south of France that I'm doing now, and the previous church plant in Grenoble. We met halfway for a weekend and spent a whole weekend together. Very intense time, and those times are great because you can pull one of the elders off and say, "How's your soul, buddy? How you doing? And how are things going?" And I'm actually learning this. This is new to me, this aspect of it. So I'm really trying to learn to do this better. But we have some things in place. We have a Reformed Baptist family camp every summer. So I see those men there. I see them when I go up and preach. We had this retreat, but you've got to figure out ways in which you can call them, and as you see Paul and Barnabas going back to the churches and encouraging them, or Paul sending Timothy for a while. All of those things are very important. You don't make a hard, clean break with a church plant when you leave it.
All right. Along the line of, it says missionary, be sensitive to the culture and the styles of dress and things like that. And one thing I've always wondered, when you go into a culture, is there a line that, you as an outside missionary, as a Christian, would not cross? And to give you an idea of what I was thinking, if I go into a foreign land, into a people group whose women are very, very scantily clad, would I then expect my wife and daughters to follow along. There's a line somewhere,
Yeah.
And the reason I ask it is so often, sometimes just here at home base, I talk to other Christians who kind of are getting into some sinful things, and I say, hey, man, it's the culture. I'm just being like the culture. And they're using, in my opinion, as an excuse.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, when Paul talks about becoming all things to all men, he also says that he is not without law. He's not without God's law. He's in law to Christ. So the parameters of how far I can adapt are defined by the law of God. And sometimes I have to be countercultural if part of the culture is a sin. I can't go there. But as long as it's not involving me in moral compromise or in sin, I adapt. So that would be the basic principle. Jim, do you want to say anything on that?
That is the battle, isn't it? With that we would not in any way distort the gospel, at the same time to accommodate in all ways that we can.
David, what kind of advice would you give to a church that's never planted or sent out a missionary before? What do you think, just in terms of the most important things for the sending church to take into account beyond what you've talked about today? Or if you wanted to highlight something that you brought out today.
To take into account from this session? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit difficult because you haven't got anyone who's out there planting indigenous churches. But I would say make your church culture sensitive, so that and that can be important no matter where you are, because we're rubbing with people of different cultures, aren't we? And as we become sensitive to the reality of cultures, that there are things that people do in a very different way from us. It makes us able to embrace people and minister to them in whole new ways. And you can already begin to do that as you pray for countries, as you maybe talk about how people live in a certain place, as you have missionaries in and ask them to tell their stories about the culture and what's different there. I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I would say, just Chris, because of that, one reason why it's so important in America is Americans are not typically very culture sensitive. Europeans tend to be more, because they're always rubbing shoulders with other cultures that are, the German and the French are really not alike, even the Swiss and the French. And so they're always talking about one another's culture. Culture is a topic of conversation all the time. But Americans, they don't realize, you don't eat peanut butter? So yeah, just to make people sensitive to the whole issue of culture is already a step in the right direction.
Thank you.